Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks particularly to Yusuf and the team from the Institute for asking me to participate in this. By the way, I'm not a consultant. I'm a full-time researcher at the Mandela Institute at University of Fort Hare, and I don't know where, I often hear this being said, but it's not true at all. I think this is such an important issue that having discussions like this are absolutely critical. And that's the reason why, although I'm not an expert in this area, I know the literature, some of it, but there are people who are far more capable in this area. I agreed to participate because I think I have some ideas to share, which I hope will provoke stronger discussion on this issue. And I'm perfectly happy to field criticisms of my perspective, which I think will become clear as I go along. I want to begin with two quotations. The first is taken from an interview with Mr. Warren Buffett, conducted by Ben Stein for the New York Times. Stein went to visit Buffett and was asking him about, because Buffett actually had a list of his staff and the ratio of tax they pay relative to incomes. And on that it was pretty clear, and Buffett admitted it immediately, that proportionate to his income, his staff, ordinary staff, clerks, cleaners, telephonists, etc., paid a considerably greater amount of tax than he does. And he, of course, said, well, he understands exactly that. And when Ben Stein said to him, well, aren't you, whenever I raise this question, by the way, Ben Stein is a conservative, he says in his article, he's a political conservative. But when I raise this question with people like yourself, I'm accused of stirring class war. Well, Buffett says to him, this was Buffett's response, there's class war, all right, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. The other quote is taken from the other great billionaire of our times, philanthropist, none other than Gates, writing in his book, Creative Capitalism. And he argues that the genius of capitalism lies in its ability to make self-interest serve the wider interest. But to harness this power so it benefits everyone, we need to refine the system. We need to develop an approach where governments, business, and non-profits work together to stretch the reach of market forces so that more people can make a profit or gain recognition. And he says, doing work that eases the world's inequities. As you can see, these are intensely ideological statements. And in fact, they represent what exactly is the major global debate today. My own approach, by the way, is also intensely ideological because it sets out to propose a set of ideas, ideals, values, assumptions, propositions based on a set of interests, which I think we need to have on the table in order to have an honest and frank debate about these things. So you can see that the perspectives on this issue are not just incidental. They are fundamental to the nature of the global system which we live in and which we hope to promote and which we aspire to. And so I don't intend to be quite honest, I don't intend looking more closely at the issues that Yusuf raised. I have an interest in all of that, but I don't think today is the day for me to talk about the opportunism of those who want to enter into the public schooling system and public services, the public good in general. I don't want to talk about the qualitative and quantitative issues. The literature is absolutely clear on it, that it's ambiguous. And by the way, even the literature, the essential point about it is that if you evaluate schooling systems contextually, then you will begin to understand why particular schools do better than others. It's not no great miracle to understand that, you know. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about what Keith Lewin raises in a number of questions about the nature of these partnerships. I'm not going to talk about what there's this wonderful book by Diane Ravitch, which talks about the hoax of the privatization movement. You can all read that. I'm not going to talk about the standardization of tests. I'm not going to talk about the attack on teachers' rights. I'm not going to talk about the reduction of salaries. I have no interest. You can talk about all that. And as my friend Salim Vali has written, I'm not going to talk about rates of profitability and, of course, you know, executive pay and so on and so forth. Because I want to speak about the provenance of this global movement for privatization, not only for schools, but in general. So the important issue for us to understand these debates, the background to these debates, is the origin of the ideas of privatization. And you have to have a long view of history to understand these things, because what is happening now at the behest of global corporate capitalism is a sea change in the very nature of capitalism. Is in fact, we are being taken into a completely different epoch, but in the history of capitalism, its contradictory nature, the crises, and the destruction of the planet. That's where we are going with this. So I'm not going to talk about whether there are different kinds of, forgive me, Yusuf, of different kinds of private schools, whether there is a balance between this and that and the other type, and where, you know. And I am talking about, you know, when I wrote an article in the Mail and Guardian 2 or 3 years ago, I got a letter from a church school saying, by the way, you know, you're talking about all of us as though we're all the same. No. I myself come from a grant school, you know. In a little town I grew up, people put money together because apartheid didn't support those schools. So I know that, but they didn't do it for profit. They certainly didn't do it for that. They did it because of their genuine concern about the building of communities. So the provenance, the origins of the movement for privatization arises, and you have to think about this carefully, in two particular phenomena, I think, over the last century. It's about, you know, you have to look at this view from a long view of history. In the first instance, it has to do with the repeated, continuous convulsions and crises in the development of modern capitalism. Because in the interwar years, capitalism was in danger of revolutionary upheavals, you know. If you read the history of this period, and I'm not just talking of the Russian Revolution, the Piano Rosso in Italy, the Rata in Germany, the Clyde movement in the UK, real revolutionary movements which threatened to place workers at the charge of societies. This is what capital was terrified about. And in fact, it is this which led Hitler to smash the workers' organizations and then to murder millions of Jews and other people. But the first concentration camps were built for socialists, and that's where they were put. So it was this particular fear that in fact there are possibilities of revolutionary movements which will destroy capitalism, that begins to make the idea of how do we change and yet not change, into the menu of future policy. The, the other thing was, of course, the boom and bust cycles which characterized capitalism throughout its history, throughout its 20th century history. Continuous instability, one day is higher rates of inflation, next day it's stagflation, the third day is, some other. And although Keynes attempted to teach governments about the importance of interventionist state policies, pump priming to get greater circulation of capital and so on and so forth. Capitalism, because of its inherently contradictory nature, something which was explained, 150 years ago. I see the book Marx's Capitalized suddenly becoming the best read book. It certainly is the best read book in Germany, despite those Fukuyama and others saying the history has come to an end. But and I'm not repeating all of that. I'm merely saying that the idea that there are such severe and fundamental contradictions in this system of production, that idea it doesn't need more proof. It is there in the corpses of the millions of people who suffer the consequences. And then, of course, in modern capitalist economies, class conflict continues despite the social democracies in the post-war period. And anti-colonial struggles begin to put some more pressure and begin to stamp their feature on historical evolution, begin to say, we won't tolerate this any further. And these are the crises, on the one hand, which lead ultimately to the crisis of the 1970s, which Yusuf talked about. On the other hand, the second and very important development in the 20th century was the decay of the Stalinist command economies of the Soviet Russia and its satellites. This decay was also almost inevitable given the utterly bureaucratic command planning systems under Gosplan, which would, by the way, I must tell you this, that I read an article by Bob Wolf saying that the Stalinist commandists who occupied that high-rise building for the Gosplan would be envious of the levels of concentration of decision-making in the corporate world today. That in fact, what the corporate world, you can imagine the size of the corporations I'm talking about, and who makes the central decisions? How many people make those decisions which affect the lives of millions of people? I think it's true that the Gosplaners might have been envious about the capacity of modern corporate capitalism, added to the fact that it's got fantastic technological capability to make plans which affect the lives of millions and the environment. So, and of course, the other factors which utterly destroyed the Soviet state is dangerously autocratic-led party officials, completely fixated by the power of the Central Committee. The total destruction of the democratic institutions created under the leadership of workers, peasants, and soldiers in the Soviets, and the inability, of course, to compete with capitalist production systems, which was exacerbated by the obsolescence of Soviet technologies. All of which exacerbated further by the Soviet Union's. Is that true? Well, let me say then that what we have is the building of an ideological edifice over the last 40 or 50 years. People have called it neoliberalism. That's what is the basis, the genesis of what we have today, parading or stamping its authority as the privatization of public resources, and private corporations salivating at the idea of 71 trillion rands to be invested in the next 10 or 15 years out of the public purse, for which ordinary citizens will continue to be liable for generations to come, because that money will come from taxpayers. And the effect, and the effect of this privatization, I'll run through them quickly because, people write about this. They are now, if I had to collect the books I've looked at, it would reach the ceiling. They talk about it as trade liberalization, managerialism, new forms of governance. The real effect of these things are that it has reduced the sovereignty of democratic states to whimpering servants. That's what's happened to the states. It's grabbed hold of states, so-called democratic states, and has made them into really tools for the use of private greed and power. It has created an environment, global environment of war on humanity, destruction of nations, 3 or 4 or 5 in the last 10 years. It has begun to ravage the natural environment. It has created a kind of determinist logic. Everything must go according to growth rates, GDP. We are now in the era, Karl Marx would be turning in his grave. He was accused of being a Marxist, which meant that he was an economic determinist. Come and read the stuff that's going on now, Mr. Marx, and you will see that you're a pale shadow of what's really going on. And the other thing is that all of this ultimately is the attack on democracy, is the attack on the right of you and me to make decisions. It is the attack on the right of you and me to call for accountable government. It is an attack on our right as citizens. It is an attack on our fundamental human ability to act as creative citizens in a collective way. A civilization which Homo sapiens, us, our genus, has created over 160,000 years at least, if you were to go to pinnacle point, possibly 200,000 years, is at the edge of its life if this marauding, barbaric system continues to have its way. So I'm no scholar, and I'm not dispassionate in my scholarship. I don't pretend to be any of that. I look at social reality because in the places where I work, amongst the most marginal constituencies of our society, this is the reality. It's not the reality that we see, most of us, even me, in our middle class life. We have none of that. And it's about time we as academics and people with a social conscience act as the activists, the intellectual and practical activists that we are meant to be, because that's what we are being paid for. Thank you very much.